Which darning technique is best to use? What tools and materials do you need to start darning socks and knitwear? These are some of the questions that I'm going to answer in today's video. Hi, my name is Matilda and welcome back to Miss Matti, the channel where I share all about how to live an awesome and sustainable life. And this video that I'm sharing with you today is the first of 5 videos all about darning socks and knitwear. I have created 4 darning tutorials coming up very shortly here on this channel. In these videos I will teach you the most common darning technique that I will call the warp and weft darning technique. That is because you simply create a weave effect over the whole, and then I will share with you how to Swiss darn, also known as duplicate stitch, Scotch darning, as well as machine darning. So if you're interested in these videos and you're not already subscribed, please hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you will not miss once those videos are live. If you want to check out any of these darning tutorials once they are live, check out the description box down below as well as the cards above. So what I'm going to go through in this video is all the materials you will need to darn socks and knitwear by hand. I will not go into depth into what to use when it comes to machine darning, as I will go into that much more in depth in that specific video. So what do you need to start darning socks and knitwear? When it comes to yarns to use, I like to use a 2 or 3 ply darning thread or yarn. I also really like to use sock yarn, which is generally a wool nylon blend. But you can of course also use 100% wool, 100% cotton, or whatever materials you have at hand. Just make sure that it's not bulky or coarse, especially if it is used on socks. You want to make sure that the socks are comfortable to wear, and if you are in doubt, always go for finer rather than bulkier yarn. You can of course also use embroidery floss. I really like the brand DMC, and then depending on how thick or thin your knitted piece is, you can choose how many strands you will use from the embroidery floss. For example, thin wool or embroidery floss works really well in thin wool garments, and the latter gives a really strong and sturdy repair as long as the garment itself is of good quality from the beginning. Now let's talk about darning needles. Darning needles are different than regular sewing needles as the tip is blunt and the eye of the needle is larger compared to a regular sewing needle where they have a sharp tip and a small eye. Sometimes different darning tutorials call for yarn needles, sometimes they call for tapestry needles, and sometimes they call for darning needles. So what is the difference between all of these needles and which one should you choose? Tapestry needles and darning needles are very similar. Both have a blunt tip and a large eye, and sometimes they are even the same needle, just that they're called tapestry needle by one manufacturer and a darning needle by another. However, sometimes there is a slight difference, and then often the darning needle is slightly longer than the tapestry needle. Yarn needles are also very similar to tapestry needles and darning needles. Sometimes yarn needles, unlike tapestry needles and darning needles, come sold in plastic. I personally prefer metallic yarn or darning needles, but this is a personal preference and they can often be used interchangeably. So which needle size should you pick for darning? I generally would recommend you to use a long, thin darning needle when it comes to darning. But with that being said, let the yarn you use or the embroidery floss you use guide you. The yarn should comfortably be able to go through the eye of the needle, and if it doesn't, pick a larger needle. The needles that I use are bought in a pack of 3 from the brand Clover, and I will link in the description down below where you can get them. If you repair a lot of socks, I would highly recommend you to invest in a darning mushroom or egg. I will link a couple of options in the description down below. And this one is mine here. I got this one on Etsy and I just love how beautiful it is. and I use it when I'm not done with it as a decoration here in the office over on that shelf there. I just like that it's a functional item but also a beautiful item at the same time, and I really also like that they have this little thing where you can store your darning needles. However, you do not need to have a darning mushroom or egg to make a successful sock darn. There are lots of items that you can use instead. I have, for example, used an orange in the past, which actually works surprisingly well. You can also use tennis ball, maracas, plastic Easter eggs. I've even seen people on Instagram use light bulbs and a baseball bat. There's so many options out there. So I would just invite you to be creative with the items that you have around the house. And if you have any other suggestions on what to use instead of a darning mushroom, leave a comment down below and let us know. If you have trouble creating the right tension when darning other items that are not socks, I would highly recommend you to invest in an embroidery hoop. I recommend a smaller embroidery hoop, 4 to 6 inches wide. I generally find you do not need any bigger than that. My advice is to look at the knitted items that you need to darn. Look at the knitted pieces that you need to darn. Does the area that you need to darn need to be stretchy or sturdy? Think about the movement you do in that garment and the wear and tear it gets. For example, a darn on a stock heel does not need to be very stretchy, however, it needs to be very sturdy. But other parts of the foot might need a darn with a more elasticity in it. For example, if you darn an elbow or a knee, you will need to select a much more stretchy darning technique. However, depending on the knitted technique that is used on the garment, you will have to decide how much to follow or break these rules. So when shall you machine darn? I find machine darning best when I would normally find a hand darn too tedious for me to do. Machine darning has very little stretch in it, but it's worth doing as it's fast, easy, and it creates a strong repair. You can darn on a machine either using the free arm or an embroidery hoop attachment, or as I did in my upcoming video, which is using a makeshift embroidery hoop. I will go through in more details on what tools and materials you need to machine darn in that video specifically, because most of the things I've gone through in this video have been relating to darning socks by hand. So in that video I'll go into more detail what you need specifically to make a successful machine darn. Even though I mainly talk about darning socks and knitwear in this video, it's worth mentioning that darning woven fabrics by hand requires a lot of skill and patience to do successfully. And this is true even if you make an invisible mend or a visible mend. If you want to darn woven fabrics, I highly recommend machine darning or attaching a patch on top of the hole. Unless you of course are very skilled at hand stitching, then just go for it. But I just wanted to highlight that back in the day, seamstresses and tailors trained for 4 years to make a perfect invisible darn on woven fabrics. I do not want to discourage you from darning woven fabrics. I just want you to have a realistic expectation on the result you might produce, because it requires a lot of skill and practice and patience to make a hand-darn woven piece look neat and tidy. Of course, you can also make a visible repair when you just play with the whole not so perfect and neat look and make it a thing, and that's totally fine. I just do not want you to feel discouraged if your darn doesn't look perfect. The technique that I call the warp and weft darning technique is the most common one, and this is one where you simply create a weave effect by weaving threads vertically and horizontally across each other. If it's done along the lengths or the rows of the knitting, it creates a very sturdy repair with very little stretch. This makes it perfect to do on a sock heel, for example. However, if you do it the other way around along the knit stitches instead, you're able to use the elasticity of the knitted piece itself, and that actually can create a much more stretchy darn than if you do it along the rows. And that makes it perfect to use on, for example, elbows and knees. Scotch darning is a perfect technique to use on bigger holes than, for example, the warp and weft darning technique. It's stretchy vertically, but it's stiff horizontally, and this is something to bear in mind when you create your darn. This technique is perfect to use if you need a stronger and stretchier repair than the warp and weft darning technique. It is also in general quicker to do than the warp and weft darning technique. Just make sure to pick a shorter darning needle for this technique. Now let's talk about Swiss darning, also known as duplicate stitch. Sometimes this is used in place of intarsia and is also known sometimes as embroidering on knits, and that is because you are literally duplicating those little V's of the stockinette stitch. This technique is perfect to both use for visible mending as well as invisible mending. You can Swiss darn both across a hole as well as over a worn out area, which I do in my tutorial on Swiss darning. I decided to make my darn to look like a patch with a heart inside, but if you darn in the same yarn and make sure to keep the same tension as your knitted piece, you can create an almost invisible mend as it's copying those little V's of the stockinette stitch. If you Swiss darn across a hole, you want to make sure to straighten the edges around the hole and then lay a foundation thread. If you want to find out more details on how to do this, I will link some resources in the description down below. Please note that if you are doing any of the other darning techniques that I mentioned here in this video, you should stay away from cutting the edges of the hole, and once you have darned the hole, then you can cut off any loose threads, but not until then. I really hope this video helps you in which darning technique to pick and which materials to use and which tools to use to make a successful darn. And if it did, hit that like button, and until next time, bye!